Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am Melissa Lavinson. I am the Executive Director of the Office of Energy Transformation for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And today you're joining the Decarbonizing the Peak Focus Area Work Group webinar. I'm going to go through the agenda and let folks know who the other presenters are and help orient everybody as to what this is and what we're going to be doing. And then we will be able to take some questions and answers via the Q&A function on the Zoom. And we're going to run this webinar for the next 90 minutes. So again, thank you everybody for joining. I am Melissa Lavinson. I am joined today by some co-presenters. I'm going to be joined by Jonathan Blair and Kevin Steinberger of E3, as well as Kate Zyla, the Executive Director of the Georgetown Center on Climate Change, and Carrie Jenks of Harvard Law's Environment and Energy Law Program. So I'm going to walk through the agenda. We're going to spend a little time orienting everybody on what the Office of Energy Transformation is, the context in which we're working, and what these focus area work groups are, as well as the process. Then we're going to hear from Jonathan and Kevin at E3. They're going to provide an overview of and background on what peak energy demand is, how it's met today, and some of the characteristics of the facilities that serve it. Then we're going to transition to talking about what this work group is, the work plan that we have in place, and how folks can participate in the working group. And then finally, we'll answer some questions. If we don't get to all the questions that are posed in the Q&A function, we will take them and we'll write them up and we will post the answers on the Office of Energy Transformation website. So with that, Jonathan, if you would go to the next slide, thank you. So just to orient everybody here in Massachusetts, we have leading climate and clean energy mandates. And I use the word mandate because we have enshrined much of our climate and clean energy goals into law. We have a goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we've established an electrification-based pathway to get there. In order to implement that, we have established a series of programs and regulations that are going to help move us away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, including offshore wind and solar. We are moving towards programs that are allowing us to deploy more solar at the community level. We have leading energy efficiency programs, demand response programs, through Mass Save, our Connected Solutions program, our Clean Peak Standard. And we really worked hard to advance transportation electrification, including advancing enabling the charging infrastructure that's going to allow us to more readily charge our vehicles across the state. And finally, we have some of the leading building codes and standards, including the municipal stretch energy codes, which are moving towards fully electrified fossil-free buildings. And finally, we're doing all this with a focus on equity, affordability, and economic opportunity. And I want to be really clear that that is a pillar of how we're moving forward, how we're engaging, and how we're going to be transforming our energy ecosystem here in Massachusetts. The Justice Administration is fully committed to a just and equitable transition for all of our communities, workers, and businesses across the Commonwealth. So what is the Office of Energy Transformation? We were established in May of this year, and it's the first of its kind in the nation, the Office of Energy Transformation. It was charged with two things. One, really enabling the hands-on execution of the clean energy transition. And then secondly, to make sure we were bringing the breadth of the energy ecosystem together as we did that. And the areas of focus for the office, as you see on this slide, the gas to electric transition, electric grid readiness, and a just and equitable transition for workers, businesses, and communities. And one of the things that we did before we launched the Office of Energy Transformation was we took time to do outreach and engagement across the breadth of the energy ecosystem to get input into what the office should focus on and how folks wanted to see it function. And there were two key takeaways from that. One was that folks wanted us to really focus on tangible things to demonstrate what the transition meant and to really be able to see an outcome at the end of that. And the second, people really wanted to have the breadth of the energy ecosystem come together so that they could exchange ideas, they could work together, they could hear the perspectives of others. And that's what we've done here at the Office of Energy Transformation. So if you want to go to the next slide. We're going to advance the charge and the mission of the office two ways. One, the Energy Transformation Advisory Board, that is really where we're bringing the breadth of the energy ecosystem together. The advisory board was established in July and had its first meeting September 30th. And really that advisory board is like a governing body for the work of this office. It's about 70 plus individuals that represent all geographies of the state, labor, environmental justice, environmental advocates, business, utilities, manufacturers, renewable developers, storage developers, delivered fuel companies, really the breadth of the energy ecosystem here in the state to work together, to hear from each other, and to figure out solutions to advancing our climate and clean energy goals. And then the advisory board has affirmed and approved 3 focus area work groups. And today's focus area work group is on decarbonizing the peak, but I want to give a little background on the other 2. First one that you see on the left of your screen, transitioning away from the Everett Marine Terminal liquefied natural gas facility. That focus group is really going to be working towards what the embodiment of the gas to electric transition is. For those not aware, the Everett Marine Terminal liquefied natural gas facility is located in Everett, Massachusetts. It provides a strategic gas supply resource for the state's local gas distribution companies. Those local distribution companies entered into contracts with that facility for 6-year supply source. When the Department of Public Utilities approved those contracts, they also required the utilities to develop plans to move away from our reliance on that facility. And that's what that focus group is going to be working on. We're going to be launching that focus area work group on November 4th. And for those interested in that, you'll be able to go to the Office of Energy Transformation website and sign up for that. To my right on the screen is financing the transition. That's really going to be focused on exploring alternative mechanisms for paying for the investments needed to enable the electric grid to really support the climate and clean energy goals of the state. Right now, we finance those investments on utility bills, and this is going to be looking at alternative mechanisms for financing some aspects of those investments. And then finally, the focus area work group we're looking at today, decarbonizing the peak. This focus area work group is really going to be looking at pathways to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel fired peaking power plants and combined heat and power facilities, and deploy alternative demand and supply side options to meeting our peak load needs here. It's a really important area to take a look at, and we're going to hear a little bit from E3 about why this is important, how this is going to help us achieve our climate and clean energy goals, and really looking at it in a very balanced way. We're going to be looking at both the supply and demand side options, and we're going to be looking at it in very specifically across 4 facilities around the Commonwealth that we'll talk about a little bit later. So with that, I'll turn it to the next slide. So what does it mean to participate in one of these focus area work groups? A couple things. One, the work, as I mentioned, of these focus area work groups at a high level is governed by the advisory board. We had our advisory board meeting. They voted on and approved these focus area work groups, as well as the work plans associated with them. So we have our charge, we have our mission, we have an established work plan of how we're going to move through things. Secondly, these focus area work groups, they will be meeting bi-monthly, so every other month or more often as needed. And we're going to be conducting the work through individual work streams, and we'll go over that a little bit later. The work of the focus area work groups and the work streams, they are going to be Chatham House rules. We want people to be able to really come and engage and have honest conversations. However, once recommendations are made, once materials are finalized, everything will be delivered to the advisory board. And at that time, everything will be made public and posted on the Office of Energy Transformation website for everyone to see. And we're really going to be working towards consensus. And I want to really focus on that for a second. We really want to bring people together to engage, to work through an understanding of what the issue is, what the alternatives are, and what the outcomes and solutions might be to address some of these areas. If we can't come up with consensus in the work groups, we'll be very clear about that, and we'll post the positions of the various parties. So what does it mean? What is the responsibility of a participant? And what's the responsibility of these work groups? One, to execute on the work plans, as I mentioned, that have been established and approved by the advisory board. Again, it really is a responsibility to try to work cooperatively to seek consensus. And where there's not consensus, we are going to be really clear about where positions are. And for individual members, we're asking everybody to commit to a one-year term and actively participate and attend all meetings. We will have meetings both in person and always have a virtual option. We're asking that if you are a participant or want to put a participant forward for your organization, that they have some level of expertise or command of the topic. So again, we're going to go through what this area is really going to focus on, and you can think through what that means for you or your organization. That if you're part of an organization, that you do have some level of decision-making authority and that you can speak on behalf of the organization. That the expectation is that we're going to follow the work plans and the process adopted by the advisory board. And that's really important, and we'll go through what that process is. That everyone's going to work in good faith, and that we have a series of ground rules and remote participation policies that were adopted by the advisory board. Those are available on the website. And so the expectation is everybody will follow those. And that failure to comply with that could result in removal from the work group, because we really worked hard and worked with the advisory board to establish what we think is a really good set of ground rules and participation policies. Let's go to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about the process and what the advisory board has approved. So we've been approved to work through all of our topic areas in basically 3 phases. So and every focus area work group is launching with a webinar like today, informational only. But the 3 phases that the way we're working through this is, one, starting with an understanding of the issues and the perspectives. So on this focus area work group, that's what we're going to start to ground everybody in. What is the peak? How do we meet it today? What are the assets that we use? How do we use them? How are they compensated? Really answering some very grounding foundational questions so that everybody can feel like they have a base level of knowledge and that we all are working from a shared set of data, assumptions, facts, information. Then once we identify and have a base level of understanding of the topic and the issues that we're going to cover, then we'll move on to alternatives and solutioning. What are the alternatives to meeting peak demand, for example, other than we meet it today? What are different solution sets, technologies, ways of doing that, both supply and demand side? So we're going to look through them holistically without really many parameters. Then finally, we'll put sort of a lens on top of that and assess the alternatives, the implications of those, the environmental impacts of those, community impacts, workforce impacts, cost impacts, to come up with a set of recommendations. So really moving through in phases and not moving to the next phase until we collectively feel like we have what we need to inform the next phase of decision making. And so what this really requires for anybody participating in this work group is sort of 3 things, right? The commitment to this process and the commitment to working towards alignment around the issues, the information, to engaging to seek that understanding, to seek that consensus, to really move forward together, and providing input so that we can enable really good conversations, we can enable ideation, we can really enable the outcomes that we're working towards. And then finally, making sure that everybody is committed to working together to implement and sustain the path forward. So if you want to go to the next slide. So how can you sign up for this? And we'll do this again at the end. So this isn't your only time to take a look at this, but you can go to the website, you can look at the bylaws, the ground rules, the work plans, just so that you can help orient yourself and understand, is this something you want to participate in? We're going to have a registration link that will be made available in the chat function for folks. You could think about this. We're going to have the registration link also on the website. You could think about this. Registration will close October 15th. Then the participant list for those that have registered, that will be provided to the advisory board so they can take a look at it and know who's going to be participating, make sure that they feel like we've got the broad representation across the energy ecosystem here in this work group. And then we're going to convene the work groups in November. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's going to be different work streams that will be working towards different issues and focus on different topic areas. Folks will be able to self-select those work streams, so you don't have to participate in everything. You can participate in a narrow aspect of what this work group will be focused on. So that's an overview of where we are, how we're moving forward, what this work group is about, and how you can sign up. And I'm going to now turn it over to E3, who will go over what peak demand is, how it's met today, and some of the policy and market drivers of that. And so I'm going to turn over to Jonathan and Kevin.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. So as Melissa mentioned, I'm with Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3, and we are very glad to have the opportunity to support the Office of Energy Transformation on this important Decarbonizing the Peak initiative. Today, we'll be sharing some of our preliminary research and analysis from phase 1 of this initiative. So in phase 1, we've been looking at characterizing state and regional peak demand, resources that contribute to meeting that peak demand and their associated economic, environmental, and public health impacts, and key policy and market drivers that impact those resources. We go to the next slide. We've outlined a few of the key questions that we want to start to dig into today to provide background and orientation for the rest of this initiative, acknowledging that we'll only begin to cover some of these topics today, and many of these questions will be areas that we continue to dig deeper into over the course of the next several months. Today, we'll cover the role that peaker power plants play in the New England electricity system, where those power plants are across the region and in Massachusetts, so that we get a sense for where these opportunities for decarbonization are. And then we'll start to tee up key questions around policies and market drivers that impact these power plants, as well as opportunities for decarbonization of another large source of fossil power generation in the Commonwealth, which is combined heat and power, or CHP, facilities. And these latter two questions will be questions that we'll certainly continue to explore over the course of this initiative. So I'll start by providing some high-level definitions and introductions to key terms before diving into a characterization of regional peak demand. Electricity consumption fluctuates both daily and seasonally. So for example, over the course of a hot summer day, electricity demand is typically at its highest in the late afternoon or evening as people get home, switch on their air conditioners, businesses are still operating. Whereas on a fall day like today, where temperatures are moderate, electricity demand is considerably lower than it is during that hot summer day, simply because not much electricity is being used to provide cooling. So the peak refers to the highest or maximum electricity demand on the system within a given time period. So that hottest summer day often ends up being the annual peak, and the late afternoon or evening often ends up being the peak hour within that day. Conversely, the minimum demand during a given time period is referred to as base demand or base load. And if we move to the next slide, historically, the electricity system was planned around these different load conditions, and generators were referred to by the type of demand that they were intended to meet. So for example, nuclear generators are designed to operate pretty much 24/7. And so they were referred to as base load generators because they met that constant source of minimum demand. Whereas more flexible power plants that ramp their operations up and down became known as peakers for their ability to quickly turn on and provide output in response to daily, hourly, and even sub-hourly fluctuations in demand. There are a number of policy and economic drivers that we expect to lead to significant shifts in both demand and the composition of electric supply in the coming decades. And I'll speak first on this slide about projected changes in electric demand. The charts on this slide and the next one reference ISO New England's analysis, the system operators analysis. And this is broadly consistent with a number of other studies and modeling efforts as well. So first, in terms of how demand is expected to change, driven by the electrification of end uses in transportation, buildings, and industry. Peak electricity demand is projected to more than double by 2050, from an all-time historical peak of about 28 gigawatts to a 2050 peak of 57 gigawatts. So as more and more people purchase electric vehicles and install heat pumps to meet their winter heating needs, electricity demand is expected to grow significantly. In addition to that growth in total electricity demand, the timing of that demand is also going to shift considerably. And in particular, the installation of heat pumps and the electrification of building heating needs will drive a shift of the system peak towards the winter months. And ISO New England expects that the regional peak will shift from a summer peak to a winter peak in the mid 2030s. That shift to a winter system peak also means that there's expected to be significantly more variability between years. And this is what the chart on the bottom right is showing. And there are two drivers of this increase in variability. The first is that as the system shifts to a winter peak, winter extreme weather just varies more widely than summer extreme weather. There's a broader range of temperatures in the New England region in the winter between years. And second, the sensitivity of electric heating equipment to changes in temperature is higher than the sensitivity of electric cooling equipment. And so as a result, the peak in 2050 will be quite variable depending on the weather in that year. And as a result, the region may need to hold even more capacity in reserve to ensure that the system remains reliable even under the most severe winter weather conditions. If we move to the next slide, oh, great. We'll also see that the composition of electric supply is expected to change significantly between now and 2040 and 2050. So this chart is, again, ISO New England's analysis focusing on 2040. And as we can see in the renewables column on the right side of this chart, the majority of New England's demand is projected to be met by variable wind and solar resources by 2040. And that represents huge growth relative to their contributions of about 10% of demand today. And it's important to note, this is shown on a percentage basis, but if we account for that increase in demand that we were showing on the prior slide, this growth would look even more pronounced. When we add in nuclear and hydro, New England is projected to meet more than 70% of its demand from zero carbon energy by 2040. So it's well on its way to meeting its long-term decarbonization goals. But we can also see in the middle column here that natural gas does still have an important role to play in a decarbonized future, contributing about 12% of the region's supply in 2040. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that with the increase in renewable energy on the grid, flexibility will become an increasingly valuable characteristic. So historically, power plants have needed to be flexible to respond to changes in hourly and sub-hourly demand. But the grid will need even more flexibility to respond not just to changes in demand, but also to changes in wind and solar output as renewables make up a larger share of total generation. So I'll now switch gears to speaking about what peaker plants are and what they typically look like today. So, as we've discussed, peaker plants play an important role in ensuring that the system remains reliable during times of higher demand and that there's enough flexibility on the system to ramp up to meet that demand. And so by definition, peakers are flexible or dispatchable, meaning that they can be called upon by the system operator to ramp up quickly in response to changes in system needs. They also typically do not run very frequently over the course of a year. And for the purpose of this initiative, we're defining a peaker power plant as a plant that operates less than 15% of the year. Because these plants don't need to operate very often and only run during times of high prices or during times of emergency, they're also often by design less efficient and less capital intensive plants. They're generally simple cycle combustion resources, and they often also rely on oil as a backup fuel, so that they're still available to operate during times when the natural gas system is constrained. However, their relatively low efficiency and their occasional use of higher emitting fuels like kerosene and fuel oil also means that peakers contribute disproportionately to climate and air pollution. So even though they don't run very often, they do represent a large opportunity for decarbonization and other local air pollution benefits if their output can be reduced or replaced. And lastly, peaker plants often are smaller in size and have a small physical footprint, meaning that they can be located in constrained areas, such as in cities or close to other demand centers. So over the next few slides, before I turn over to my colleague John, I'll spend some time walking through an illustrative day on the New England system, just to provide another example of how and where peakers are sometimes called upon to operate. So on the top is a very simple illustration of an electricity system where baseload generators and renewables are often located in somewhat remote areas and far from cities and demand centers, with long transmission lines that deliver that power generated from those resources to customers. And then there may also be sources of generation closer to customers as well, including rooftop solar as well as peakers. And on the bottom of this slide, we've taken a day on the New England system. So this represents a real regional system demand shape, as well as the supply contributions to meeting that demand. So if we start in the morning, overnight and at the start of the day in this highlighted window in the morning, we can see that demand is relatively low and is met primarily by baseload generation. So on the bottom right, you can see nuclear running around the clock over the course of the day. And there's enough for baseload natural gas generation to meet this system demand. As demand increases in the middle of the day, behind the meter solar and other renewable generation actually helps offset that increase in demand. So that's why the net system demand does not increase, even though induced demand is increasing over the course of the day. And so that helps offset the need for additional forms of generation. But as we move to the late afternoon and evening, so getting further into the day, the behind the meter solar decreases as the sun goes down, and demand continues to increase as residential customers get home and turn on their air conditioners, for example. And that leads to a need for natural gas generation to ramp up quickly to meet that demand. And we can see the responsiveness of the natural gas generation in this chart as well. So those are generally peakers that are ramping up to meet that increase in afternoon and evening demand. This is just an illustration, and there are many other examples of when peakers might get called on and provide reliability value to the system. So if a transmission line goes down, or if there's high amounts of congestion on the transmission system, that might make it difficult to get that power from remote areas to customers. And so these peaker resources that are closer to customers provide value. Peaker resources also can provide value when there are times of sustained low renewable output, and that's something that we see especially in a future decarbonized future, that dispatchable resources are important for when there are times of multiple days with low wind and solar output. And then peakers also play an important role when other plants might be experiencing outages or be down for maintenance, or if they don't have firm fuel supply access, peakers can be available to ramp up and run on backup fuel. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague John, who will walk through in more detail some of the characteristics of peakers in Massachusetts.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So we began by distinguishing what peak demand is, how it behaves, and how peaker plants can help satisfy the need of the system. And now we're going to focus on exactly where and how these peaker plants fit into the system, both geographically and in terms of the regional capacity. So what I'd like to do is direct your attention to the map where we have several dozen peaker plants that are represented by these orange circles showing approximate location and relative size. And we have highlighted 4 specific facilities that represent partners in this working group who have volunteered to have us take a bit closer look at those facilities and the unique attributes that they represent. So just introduce those briefly, starting out west, where Hull Street Partners has a 181 megawatt facility in Pittsfield, Mass. Moving east to West Springfield, Cogentrix has a 229 megawatt facility that has recently been retired, but is undergoing a conversion to a battery storage project. And that represents an interesting case study for us to examine with respect to new adaptations for that interconnection. Heading down to the Cape, we have Canal Power Plant in Sandwich, Mass., which represents the largest fossil fuel capacity remaining in the Commonwealth at about 1.5 gigawatts of capacity. This too represents a interesting case study in terms of the interconnection agreement that's very sizable on the system, and also in terms of multiple fuel sources that can dictate how the facility responds to different economic signals. And then finally, the fourth participant in this working group is closer to the hub in Medford, Mass., where Tufts University has a combined heat and power facility for their central power plant needs. It delivers heat and electricity to the campus of Tufts University. And while not explicitly a peaker unit, CHPs have been included in this study because they are also a source of fossil emissions in the state and represent a very interesting and unique challenge and opportunity as we approach decarbonization. And one final thing I'd like to say before we move on is if we take a step back and look at where these peaker facilities are clustered, we can see a couple trends. The first is that they tend to be closer to load centers, and we can see that exhibited in the Boston area as well as out towards Springfield. The other place where they show up is areas where there are locational value. So that could be at the end of a transmission system, like we see out west, or perhaps areas that have geographical constraints, like up on the North Shore, or down towards the Cape, or even on Martha's Vineyard. And we'll talk a bit more about how that locational value is explicitly treated later on in the slides. Now, as we look at the overall resource picture in New England, we can get an idea of the relevance and the relative size and significance of these peaker assets within the context of the greater system. So ISO New England maintains about 36 gigawatts of resource capacity throughout the region, and we can see that represented by the top bar on the left-hand figure. If we look at a subset of that, we can see that about 2/3 or 63% of that total regional capacity is made up of fossil fuel resources. And about half of that operates less than 15% of the time and qualifies as fossil fuel peakers. And winnowing that down further into a subset of fossil fueled peaker plants that are located within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we can see that about 15% of the regional resource capacity meets that qualification. And so when we're thinking about the opportunity of decarbonizing the peak and the context that that has on our region, we can see that the challenge or the opportunity that exists there is about 15% of that 36 gigawatts of regional capacity to be decarbonized through the peak. Shifting our attention over to the right-hand side, we have the colorful chart that the main takeaway here is we have a consistent regional capacity over about the last 5 to 10 years. And the overall ratios of the constituents of that capacity have remained about the same. We do see a small increase that corresponds to a small increase in peak demand, but generally we're seeing fairly consistent trends throughout time in terms of the regional capacity. So what does all of this mean for emissions? Well, for that, I'd like to focus first on the graph on the upper right-hand side, which is backed by a field of blue, and that is designed to represent peak load in Massachusetts. You can see that that field, as measured against the right-hand y-axis, shows that the Commonwealth has had a relatively consistent peak demand of about 12 gigawatts over the last 5 to 10 years. Now, superimposed on that blue field, we have several lines, and we'll start with the top red line, which shows a decline of Massachusetts fossil-based emissions over that time. And so the story here is that even against a consistent peak demand, we've been able to make incremental progress statewide in reducing the fossil-based emissions in the electric sector. But the story doesn't end there. It is a bit more nuanced, and for that we'll look to the lower yellow and green lines, which represent specifically emissions from natural gas peakers and from fuel oil peakers. And we can see that the yellow line, which is natural gas peakers, actually increases over that time. And the complexity that's in that that trend suggests that the increased operation of peakers is actually enabling less or more carbon intensive baseload resources to drop offline or to operate less, and the peaker plants are picking up the difference. To further add nuance to this, we can see that the green line at the bottom that represents fuel oil peakers starts quite low and then is further depressed and follows the trend of declining over time. And that's an important story because that shows that we need to not only pay attention to the resource type, but also the fuel behind those resources when we're trying to make some of these incremental gains toward decarbonization. And for further information on that, we can look at the bottom figure where we can see how each of these fuels stack up in terms of relative carbon emission intensity. So the residual fuel oil, or RFO, is in that same green color all the way to the right. And we can see that of the fuels assessed, that's the most carbon intensive. And we can walk down the stack, moving from right to left, and see that kerosene and distillate fuel oil, or DFO, are progressively less carbon intensive. And natural gas is actually the preferred fuel, and it has carbon intensity about half of the alternative RFO. And so that tells an interesting story about how the Commonwealth has been able to make gains overall in its electric sector carbon emissions, while actually seeing a specific increase in carbon emissions from natural gas peaker units. And before we move on, I should note that while we don't explicitly discuss local pollution in terms of SOx or NOx in this slide, we have similar trends that are expressed that follow the overall carbon emissions, and that's followed by the local pollutants as well. Now, we're going to pivot and talk a bit about the influences on peaker plants and how they operate within the system, or perhaps even enter or exit the market. And for that, we're going to start with the revenue streams that are that represent opportunities for generators in the electric market. We've got 3 distinct products that are offered by the independent system operator, and those are shown in blue. And then on the right-hand side, we have a 4th product, which is offered by the state in the form of environmental attributes. And we're going to take these in order from left to right and try to understand how they influence generators in the market, but more specifically peakers. So resource adequacy is essentially ensuring that there's sufficient capacity on the system to serve demand when it may occur. And this is in the form of a fixed payment based on qualified capacity and also based on the value of that capacity within the market from year to year. And this represents the largest revenue source for most peakers because they are installed in the system for reliability, but operate infrequently. The next column to the right, energy, is what I think most of us think about when we're considering generators within the system. So this is the actual commodity flowing through the lines to customers, and it's marked on a real-time production basis in terms of dollars per megawatt hour or cents per kilowatt hour. The next column, ancillary services, is a suite of offerings that allow for real-time balancing of the grid. And this is a real revenue stream, but relatively minor compared to the other two. So we don't focus a whole lot on that. And then the final column here in green, environmental attributes. I think most of us are familiar with renewable energy certificates, or RECs, that are developed by the state to reward generators in producing clean, qualified megawatt hours of energy. And no surprise, most peaker units are not eligible to earn environmental attributes. And so those are not a major factor in influencing operations. We spoke a few slides back about the locational value of peaker units and how that could influence their value or importance to the system. And this slide just further highlights that. And it does so using a mechanism known as locational marginal pricing, or LMP. And what we can see here is a image from the ISO New England dashboard from several years ago. And it gives us a bit of a heat map that shows how pricing of real-time energy can change across the region based on constraints on the transmission system or the need for generation in certain load zones. And so just to highlight that difference, we can see that Maine, for instance, is relatively cheap and is able to take advantage of low-cost imports from New Brunswick. At the same time, we have geographically constrained areas and high load zone areas like Eastern Massachusetts, where prices are quite elevated. And one can imagine that the importance of having peaker assets in those areas for times like this would be quite valuable. And then finally, we're going to take a look at policy, where we explore three different mechanisms through which peaker plants can be influenced within the market. And we've categorized those as rules and restrictions, which can often take the form of mandates or standards that could put pressure on the operating flexibility for peaker resources, or for generators, for all generators for that matter. The policy could also take the form of incentives, and we see the introduction of new programs or opportunities for generators to either broaden their revenues or provide unique value that could be rewarded with specific tax incentives or direct payments. And then the third category is neither a carrot nor a stick, but is really more signposting. And it allows the generators in the electric industry to understand how the market is evolving and the policies that may be introduced in future years, and begin to adapt against that ever-changing landscape of the industry. We can look at these different policy categories across four different levels of jurisdiction. At the highest level, we have on the national scale policies that are introduced from entities like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, which can deploy orders that ensure fairness and reliability across the country. Also, a piece of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act can introduce new incentives for generators or for new resources that may be coming on the system, or the Environmental Protection Agency and stricter emission standards, which may put pressure on legacy resources to exit the system or to incorporate cleaner practices or upgrades. Regionally, this domain is controlled by the Independent System Operator of New England, or ISO New England. This is mostly seen through, or influences at this level are mostly seen through planning groups and long range forecasts that can inform generators on how they may want to respond and prepare themselves to adapt to a changing landscape. At the state level, this is where a lot of the decarbonization work is occurring, and this is an area that we're going to dig deeper into in future work group sessions. But we have policies like the Clean Energy Standard or Clean Peak Standard, which provide both mandates and incentives to move in a certain direction. And then locally, it's important to recognize that these assets exist within communities, and those communities have a real voice in advocating for things like specific siting considerations, environmental justice, or affordability, and they can and do help to shape the way that policies provide an equitable future for all stakeholders within the communities that generating assets serve. So next, we want to pivot slightly, and to this point, we've talked pretty much exclusively about peaker plants, but now we're going to broaden the scope a bit and just briefly cover another source of fossil fuel emissions in combined heat and power plants. These facilities offer a unique and efficient way to provide both heat and power needs to the customers that they serve. They are seen frequently throughout Massachusetts, albeit at typically smaller scale applications than in other generating resources. We can see specific applications here on the bar chart on the lower left. A lot of times these are used for industrial processes that require high heat and power needs. They can also be seen on campuses, whether that's university or medical applications, as well as in district heating applications or for hotels or other applications. And just to underscore the fact that these are not a rare oddity or a niche application, but they are fairly ubiquitous throughout the Commonwealth. There's over 250 applications, making up about 10% of the state's electric supply. Totals about 1.6 gigawatts in total installed capacity. And again, they're distinguished from peaker plants in part due to their capacity factor, where these provide more regular power needs and heating needs. And so their capacity factor tends to be greater than 25%, in contrast with peaker units that we've mentioned fall below 15% for the purpose of this study. And we can see the capacity and emissions have been held pretty consistent over the last 5 to 10 years, showing that this is it's a reliable and an important part of our power mix. And so what does this mean as we look ahead? Well, both peakers and CHPs are important sources of reliability, but also meaningful sources of carbon emissions and other pollutants. And while the Commonwealth is moving toward a decarbonization strategy, these assets are going to continue to be a relatively more higher emitting source against that evolving backdrop of the resource mix. And so even though CHPs are most often fueled from natural gas, and we've discussed that that's a cleaner option, they're going to feel pressure as as the state continues to make incremental gains on decarbonization, and they warrant specific and unique consideration in terms of how we're going to adapt. And just to wrap things up with a few key takeaways, we've discussed how peak power represents specific challenges and opportunities for decarbonization, and also that these assets represent meaningful reliability and contribute in multiple ways to the regional system. We've also discussed how even though they operate relatively infrequently, they do have disproportionate emissions that can impact carbon emissions statewide, but also local communities. We've examined the different market forces and policy drivers that can lead to peaker units joining the system, how they operate within it, and potentially how they exit the system. We've talked about how increasing demand and electrification of the transportation and building sectors is going to further stress peak, and how shifting usage patterns is going to change the way that we respond to it, and how nimble we need to be. And that's further emphasized by increasing penetration of intermittent resources like wind and solar. We also took a unique look at CHPs and how they participate in the regional power mix and the specific role that they play. And ultimately, we recognize that Massachusetts has an opportunity to consider how it will adapt both demand side and supply side alternatives to deliver the same level of flexibility and reliability that's currently represented by peakers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues, Kate and Carrie, to close things out.
Ready to go to the next slide? Thanks. And I'm just going to quickly, before we turn it over to them, just to say thank you very much to the folks at E3. Really appreciate this. A couple of things just before we go to the next section. Again, just the takeaways. While these facilities might run infrequently, they are disproportionate contributors to emissions. We could be in a position where we rely on these facilities more if we don't think about ways to both mitigate the demand, right, the need for them, as well as then to work on decarbonizing them. And we've brought in CHP systems as well, because if you think about, as Jonathan and Kevin showed us, right, we're going to be seeing a much cleaner grid in terms of the electricity provided to the grid. And these facilities will continue to run on fossil fuels, these CHP systems, if we don't sort of think about different ways of addressing, again, how they're used, why they're used, and potentially the fuels. So that's the focus of this work group. That's why we have the mission that we do. In terms of questions, we've gotten a lot of great questions, and so we will be getting to those at the end. And again, as I indicated, we will those that we don't get to in the time frame, we will provide written answers to all of them, and we'll put them on the website and send them out to the participant list in this webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate Zyla from Georgetown and Carrie Jenks from Harvard. Georgetown is going to be leading the facilitation for this work group for us, the convenings around this, with the support of Harvard Law's Energy and Environment Program.
Thanks, Melissa. And I'm Kate Zyla with the Georgetown Climate Center. We're really thrilled to be helping inform this process and working with the Harvard folks to do it. So I'm just going to say a little bit, if we can move to the next slide, about the process that we are collectively going to work through for the work stream. And this is parallel to the other two work streams that Melissa talked about earlier, in that there are these three phases we're going to go through. And the first phase is really about understanding where we are now. And that's a combination of looking at the current sort of functional electricity system of load and peak in Massachusetts, as well as looking at some of the revenue stream questions that the E3 folks were starting to look through already. And we're in phase one of this now. So the research that you saw presented by E3 is part of this exploration of where we are now for phase one. And we are expecting this will cover both supply and demand issues. This will cover both system-wide, how do peakers and CHP facilities operate in general in the system, but also looking at those 4 specific facilities that have signed up to be sort of case studies for this and to have the particular characteristics of a given place, a given technology, a given location, a given sort of point in their history considered as part of the current status and also the alternatives. So where are we now kind of phase right now? We'll move to phase 2, which is to start looking at alternatives and other options that might be available both on the supply side and the demand side. And what would they cost? What would they look like? What would their characteristics be? What would their emissions be? And then phase 3 would be a look at, okay, well, what would it take to actually implement some of these alternatives? What would that look like for policy and cost and timing and feasibility? And sort of how would we actually make that happen? Threading throughout all of these phases, we expect to continue to consider issues of land use, issues of community impacts, issues of equity, issues of environmental impact, issues of workforce. They're going to thread throughout all of these pieces, as well as policy issues, because some of this is going to be about technology in particular places, but some of this is going to be about the policy landscape and the decision making and governance that all of this sits within. So that will thread throughout all the phases as well. Next slide, please. So some of the questions and the timing for how we envision working through all of this. Once again, we're in phase 1 right now, and you're seeing here some of the examples of the kinds of topics that we're already starting to look into, again, as the E3 folks were presenting already. In terms of timing, you can see a sketch of this on the left with the circles. We're in phase 1 now, starting to identify some of these foundational data points to think about. And we imagine that this part of the exploration and conversation starts with our first work group meeting. After this informational webinar, if you sign up to be in the work group, the first conversation would start to assess some of these current status and needs. And that would run through the fall of this year and into winter of next year. And then phase 2 would extend. And if you saw on the previous slide, there's a little overlap. This may sort of start to transition as we're wrapping up one phase into another phase. But phase 2, we imagine it running through spring approximately, and phase 3, the implementation assessment running through summer of next year. So it's basically the span of a little less than a year to work from where are we now to where could we be and what would it take to get there. And you can see here on the slide some of the initial questions that you are already starting to see some of the research identifying questions about what does the system look like now, how many peaking facilities are there, what are their emissions, both in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also other emissions, how do they operate in the market, what are their costs, how are they compensated, what are the costs to customers, what are the jobs implications of these current facilities, and both looking at that set of questions generally, but also really looking at what that means for these 4 specific facilities as examples of a particular place and technology and market use and role. Next slide, please. And I'll let Carrie talk about how we're going to work through the next few months.
Great. And so I think some of the questions that we're seeing coming in are ones that we're going to keep digging deeper into. So today we just sort of launched this webinar, but we're planning a second Zoom in November to really dig deeper on some of these foundational knowledge concepts, including future load projections, ways that you can reduce peak through demand response or storage, and then thinking through some of the cross-cutting issues that go throughout the phases: land use, equity, environmental impacts, so CO2 emissions, but also community impacts from air quality and toxic emissions. What are the workforce? And then digging deep on some of the policies, both state policies, regional policies, and then federal policies to sort of level set and answer some of these questions and get input from the work group members as well. Then we're going to focus deep on some of the case studies and the plants that are part of this work group. So we will meet in Boston with the Zoom component to think about the attributes of some of the eastern plants that we're looking at, the Canal Station and the CHP at Tufts, and really use those also to dig deeper on reliability and locational impact considerations, so market dynamics and drivers for peaker plants and CHP plants in the state. and then meet out in Western Massachusetts in January with a Zoom component as well to discuss the attributes of the West Springfield plant and the Pittsfield plant, and use that time to also dig deeper on some of the policies that are affecting and opportunities for these peaker plants. In February, we'll go back to a Zoom meeting and evaluate some of the considerations, stepping back for system-wide and demand-side interventions, options for each plant. So starting to think about some of the phase 2 alternatives and thinking about some of the lessons learned, how do those apply to other facilities in the state, and explore some of the alternatives, including new policies that might be needed. The goal is to then report back to the board, the full advisory board in March, and that will sort of wrap up phase 1, and then we'll shift into phase 2, which will be really digging into deeper the alternatives. I think that's turning it back to Melissa.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. So we're gonna go to the Q&A in 1 second, but just as a reminder, so next steps in this process. First, if you would like to participate, you can sign up to participate in the work group. We will be having the work group link. I think it just went into a chat that everybody can see. So there's a link to sign up that will also be on the Office of Energy Transformation website. You can sign up there. We're asking folks before they sign up to really take a look at the bylaws and ground rules. They were approved, and the approved work plans are also available on that website, so that you can understand what it means to be a participant in a little more detail. We'll also have these slides up on that website, so you can take your time and look through them and determine whether or not full participation is something you'd like to do. We're going to close the registration in about a week, and then we'll send confirmations November 1st, and as Carrie said, with the first convening in mid-November. So that's where we are. That's next steps for this work group. So I'm going to go through the Q&A that we've received, and I'm going to ask my fellow presenters to come on camera so that they can help answer questions. And I'm going to start with a question, and I'm going to ask Assistant Secretary Ryer. He did not present, but I'm joined here by Assistant Secretary for Energy at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Josh Ryer. There was a question that came in. Can you speak to the relevance of the Clean Peak Standard program?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Certainly, it's clearly interrelated, and for folks that aren't familiar, apologies, I've got a frog in my throat here, but it's clearly interrelated. For folks that aren't familiar, the Clean Peak Standard requires an increasing amount of clean energy to be delivered during peak times, increasing over time. And so clearly that's interrelated here. I would say the big difference between the effort that's happening here and the Clean Peak Standard is just the breadth of the scope of this effort. As you heard earlier, there's things from land use considerations and workforce development that will be included in this work group. But it is envisioned as we progress and think about these things during the work group more holistically, that we'll start to think about, as you heard at the end from Carrie, the applicable state and federal policies. So certainly when we get there, we'll have to think about whether or not there are things that we learned in this process that implicate the Clean Peak Standard, and whether or not changes are necessary to either use the Clean Peak Standard to drive our recommendations or outcomes that we'd like to see from this working group, or vice versa. So hopefully that answered the question.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And we can provide information back to registrants on Clean Peak Standard, and we can provide a summary, and we'll make that, we can put that up on the website too, just so folks understand what that is. So I'm going to answer a quick question about time commitment, and then E3, I think there's several questions to you all for the presentation, so we might want to put the presentation back up to go to those slides so you could talk through it. So question came in sense of how many hours per month a participant would need to commit. Again, it's going to be sort of dependent on how many of the work streams of this overall effort that you want to participate in, but I would suggest that you anticipate anywhere between 4 to 8 hours a month of your time to participate. And again, depending on how involved you want to be, that could be more, but I would say at a minimum, I would anticipate 4 to 8 hours a month. Okay, so let's go to some of the questions on the slides. I think we had some specific questions. 2 questions, E3. One, if you could, E3, explain what residual fuel oil is, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I posted a link in the Q&A there, but residual fuel oil is a classification of heavier fuel oil. It's also sometimes referred to as fuel oil number 6, and it's just a distinction in terms of the makeup of fuel oil as it's distilled into gasoline, diesel, other forms of energy. So residual fuel oil is just a common fuel oil that power plants sometimes rely on.
Great. Then there was a question about slide 29. What is IPP?
That refers to independent power producers who own those CHP facilities.
Great, thank you. We had a question that came in. For carbon emissions, are you considering wellhead to burner tip the methane leakage from delivery of natural gas?
Yeah, that's a great question. In what we're presenting here, we're focused on burner tip or stack emissions from the power plant. But the methane leakage from natural gas consumption across sort of the life cycle is definitely an important part of the problem and an important part of decarbonization. And so while we'll be focused on reducing stack emissions from fossil-fired power plants across the state, there are co-benefits associated with reducing the operations of those units, in that you're also reducing natural gas consumption and some of that methane leakage as well.
Great. There was a question that you might have answered it directly to the person that asked it, about just providing a little more clarity on the stacked graph on 2050 peak demand. It was the graph that showed, peak demand moving from summer to winter and the shifts. Just a little more clarity on the dark and light blue versus the orange and light orange. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this chart, the different shades, so the lighter and darker and cross-hatching, refer to both parts of the chart. So the orange is covering the summer peak demand, the blue is covering the winter peak demand, and then the dark orange and dark blue represent the contributions of heating and cooling end uses towards those peak demands. The lighter shades of each color correspond to the contributions of transportation to seasonal peak demand, and then the cross-hatched refers to other sectors. So hopefully that covers the question. It does take some orientation to this chart to understand the legend.
Great. Then we also had a question about, does the increase in electric demand include data centers for AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this chart does not include the impacts of data center load growth. This is certainly an area of a lot of uncertainty right now across the country. Many regions are projecting high amounts of load growth just driven by new computing demands, including AI and other end uses. This chart is from the New England system operator, so they are not currently anticipating that, or they're not currently projecting a significant amount of data center driven load growth, but we understand that that's a source of uncertainty across the country. And while we'll continue to primarily rely on projections from ISO New England, we can certainly consider that qualitatively as another source of uncertainty as we move forward in this work stream.
Right. Then I kind of 2 questions. One on, are there any peaker plants in Massachusetts that provide a peaking resource for other states? And then secondly, do we know of any non-fossil fired peaking plants in Massachusetts or surrounding states, so other facilities that are non-fossil fired that are serving a peaking need.
Yeah, both good questions. With regard to contributions of power plants in Massachusetts to demands outside of Massachusetts and vice versa, the New England states operate as a regional market, and so there's free interchange of power across the New England region. Again, constrained by transmission lines and how much energy can flow over specific lines. So there can certainly be power that's generated in Massachusetts and used to serve other states. Because Massachusetts is one of the major load centers in New England, there's also often power that's generated in other states and is flowing into Massachusetts. And again, peakers are often located in constrained areas to help serve demand when there isn't an ability to serve all of the demand with resources from more remote areas. So peakers in Massachusetts do play an important role in serving nearby loads when there are transmission constraints.
And I think to answer the second part of the question pertaining to non-fossil peak assets, certainly that they do play into the regional mix, and we're seeing continued emergence of industrial scale battery storage, as well as integration of things like demand response on the demand side. And these are going to continue to play a larger role as we forecast into the future. This phase one was really scoped at taking a snapshot of where we stand currently. But part of the work looking ahead is going to be understanding the potential impact of those other resources and how they can help contribute to decarbonizing the peak.
Great. And then another specific question on this map, question about what the large orange dot is up there kind of in the North Shore. I think that's sort of the Salem area up there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is based on capacity, not necessarily operations. And so the former Salem footprint power plant has a capacity close to 1 gigawatt. And so that makes it a very significant asset in the system, even though it's currently not operating and it's been converted to natural gas. That's the largest asset up on the North Shore area.
So it's just showing kind of asset, not necessarily if they're operational or kind of contribution.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you. Just like sort of the Cogentrix, we have it, but it's not operating. We had just a couple of questions. I'm going to go back to the organizational questions. Can an organization of more than one person set out to be a part of the work group? Yes, we can. What we would ask though on that is you could have multiple people participate. We could have multiple people participate in the work streams. However, when we come to create sort of consensus of a representative on the actual work group, we would ask that one organization kind of sit in that chair. It doesn't mean others can't participate in the meetings, that they can't participate in the work streams and provide a contribution. But when we come to kind of create the consensus, we're going to take it per organization, not by person, if that makes sense to folks. Let me see if I have any more questions. There was a comment to make sure that we're taking into consideration equity, environmental justice concerns and issues around these facilities. And hopefully Carrie answered that when she went through how we're going to be looking at these. That's actually one of the reasons why we're looking at specific facilities to understand their local and community impacts and the locational impacts on the surrounding neighborhoods, as well as the broader community, and looking at that also as we think through what alternatives might be. So appreciate the comment, and absolutely we're going to be taking all that into consideration as we work through and do the analysis. Trying to think, see if there's any other questions. Do any of my other colleagues on the phone see anything we haven't answered yet at a high level? We have some comments. looking for questions. It's a question. Do the projected load growths on slide 14 include increases in energy efficiency and demand reduction programs, or is it business as usual?
So those load growth projections are from ISO New England. I believe they do include a significant amount of electrification and energy efficiency measures as part of those electrification strategies. So, for example, as the region encourages electrification of building heating, that's also an opportunity to go into those buildings and improve the building shell and insulation and perform efficiency measures as well. So I believe it does include meaningful amounts of energy efficiency in addition to this electrification-driven load growth.
Great. Yes, and then typically ISO New England does that, right? They take all the inputs in, looking at state policies, looking at trends, their propensity modeling to sort of figure out what the expectations are of growth. I had a question about will process include examining peak shaving? Will National Grid, Eversource, municipal providers participate? They are absolutely invited to participate. We anticipate that they will be participating. They all do sit on the advisory board as well. So we have a very good representation from municipalities themselves, from municipal providers, from the associations representing them, as well as from the various electric distribution companies. And yes, we will be looking at both sides, both demand and supply. That's sort of why we encapsulated in decarbonizing the peak, looking at both sides. First, can we mitigate it? And then what can we do to decarbonize how we meet that, the remaining peak? So that's the process that we're going to be looking at. Just trying to see if there's any other questions on here that we haven't answered. Do load growth charts include using home batteries, EV batteries, et cetera? Yes, this is what's anticipated. This is, again, ISO New England, but they try to anticipate all of that in their projections. Again, looking years out can be challenging over time. And so part of what this group is going to be also looking at is what role can some of those technologies play in helping to mitigate peak demand. We had a question of supply side. We're going to be, again, not constraining this. In the early days, we're going to be looking at what are both all the demand and all the supply side options to helping to both, again, mitigate peak, but also decarbonize how we meet that remaining peak load in what supply sources that are available. And I think with that, we've answered the questions. Megan, if you also want to put in the chat, if you could put a link to the website for Office of Energy Transformation. I think that was a question somebody asked if we could do that. And so while she does that, and we can send that out, we will send out that link as well as the registration link to all participants. I think we've answered all the questions, so I don't think we need to do follow up with the questions. As we said, this is being recorded, so the recording of this will be available. You can share it with others in your organization, others in your network, so that they have an opportunity to hear what was presented today. So I want to say again, thank you to the presenters. Thank you for everybody who joined. We had really robust participation. I think at peak, we had about 140 folks participating, which is great. It's awesome to see that interest. So thank you again. Look forward to folks signing up, and then we will launch the work group in November. And with that, I will call this end of webinar. So thank you very much.